I won't leave my child. What would you do if the person who holds your future looks at your baby like she's seeing a ghost and almost breaks? If you believe family is something you build with your hands, not just your blood, stay close. This story moves fast and cuts deep. But before we begin, if you enjoy powerful, thought-provoking stories drawn from real lives, tales of love, betrayal, mistakes, and second chances, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like and hit subscribe. It helps others discover this corner where life itself writes the most dramatic scripts. And share with me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? It's always fascinating to see how these stories travel across the world and connect us all. Now take a deep breath, clear your mind, and let's step together into a story that just might change the way you look at life. The chill of October slipped through the cracked window of a rented studio apartment, but Sophia held her daughter close, letting her warmth push back the draft. Zaya's small hands rested against her chest, trusting, calm, as if she knew her mother could hold off the whole storm with nothing but her arms. On the phone in Sophia's hand glowed a line of text that looked more like a lifeline than an ad. Housekeeper with live-in option, conditions negotiable. She read it 3 times, barely breathing. Childcare cost more than her rent, and the cheap daycare in town was already out of reach. Her part-time shifts had ended with a curt text from a manager who never asked if she had food left in her fridge. The envelope under her pillow held less than a week's worth of bills. Sophia thought about the choices she never had and whispered against her daughter's curls that this little girl hadn't asked to be born in a storm. The number dialed almost by itself. Sophia expected silence, or worse, another clipped rejection. Instead, a woman's voice came through, smooth, rich, with a softness rare on the other end of a help-wanted call. The woman introduced herself as Lydian Pierce and listened without rushing, even when Sophia explained she had a baby. After a pause long enough for Sophia's heart to sink, Lydian said quietly that she should come tomorrow morning for an interview. Sophia wrote down the address, her hand shaking as though she had been handed more than paper, perhaps a door. All night she prepared. She ironed her one good blouse until its seams looked almost new. She packed a small tote for Zaya, formula, diapers, the faded toy that still rattled like hope. She laid the child down on the thin mattress, watching her drift to sleep with the unshakable peace only children knew. Sophia whispered into the dark that maybe this time something would change. Morning brought the heavy drum of her own heartbeat. The bus ride blurred past. When she stepped off, the street grew wide, quiet, lined with trimmed hedges that seemed too clean to let anyone like her pass. At the end of the drive rose the Pierce estate, 2 stories tall with pale columns that caught the early light. Sophia stood before the iron gates, her knees trembling. Her chest pounded like the drumline of a Sunday service, a rhythm impossible to ignore. The gates opened with a slow creak. She carried Zaya down the stone path, each step sounding louder than the last. Inside, the housekeeper Bertie led her through polished halls into a sitting room where Vaughan Pierce, tall and composed, asked her about her skills. She told him she could cook, clean, sew, and most of all she could stay steady even when nights were heavy with a crying child. Vaughan nodded, his questions direct, almost kind. Then footsteps sounded on the grand staircase. Lydian appeared in a flowing emerald dress, her hair pinned neat, her presence filling the air before her voice could. Her gaze fell on Sophia, but within seconds drifted past her to the small child in her arms. The colour drained from her face as if the sight had stolen her breath. Sophia shifted nervously, whispering that this was her daughter, Zaya, just 1 year old. The baby blinked up, calm as always. For a heartbeat the room seemed to tilt, and Lydian swayed, her hand clutching the railing. Vaughan reached for her shoulder, his tone alarmed, but she could not look away from the child. In that moment Sophia felt the ground under her shift. She had only come seeking a roof and work, yet the woman who held her future in a single word looked at her baby as though she had seen a ghost. The Pierce house breathed with order, every surface polished, every step echoing longer than it should. Sophia followed Bertie, the housekeeper, through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed too sharp for paint. Vaughan Pierce met her in the main hall. He stood broad-shouldered, neatly dressed in a grey jacket, and carried the kind of presence that made words feel heavier when he spoke. He asked about her skills and her habits, if she knew how to keep to a schedule, if she understood the rhythm of a household that never paused. Sophia answered with quiet certainty, naming the work she knew: cooking, cleaning, ironing, staying steady even when nights were long with a restless child. Vaughan gave a small nod, the faintest curve of approval. Bertie remained at his side, her clipboard tucked like a shield under her arm. She studied Sophia not with suspicion but with calculation, the way someone checks a lock twice before leaving the house. When Sophia shifted Zaya on her hip, the older woman's eyes dropped to the child, then back up with a warning wait. The house might have opened its doors, but the rules here were older than the walls. Lydian entered a moment later, her composure gathered tight as silk. She smiled faintly, asked about Sophia's age, her history, whether she could adapt to the demands of such a place. Her voice never broke, yet her eyes betrayed her, darting again and again to Zaya. Each time the little girl gurgled or reached a hand toward the air, Lydian stiffened, then forced her gaze elsewhere. Sophia noticed but kept her silence. By afternoon, Vaughan led her across the grounds to a small cottage tucked behind the hedges. 2 rooms, a kitchen and a narrow porch. Humble compared to the house, but more than Sophia had dared to hope. He explained that meals would be provided, hours would run from 7 to 7, and any needs could be brought to Bertie or Lydian. His tone was professional, nearly kind, but beneath it lay the weight of expectation. Sophia nodded with gratitude, though her heart trembled at the enormity of what she had just agreed to. When the sun slipped low, Bertie lingered in the doorway of the cottage. She looked at Sophia, then at the baby sleeping in her arms, and spoke in a voice low enough to carry the sting of truth. Rules ran this place, not people. "You keep your head down," she said flatly. "We do everything by the book here, girl. No bending, no breaking. That's how you last." Sophia swallowed, whispered that she understood. Night drew its curtain heavy and slow. Sophia laid Zaya in the crib and pressed her forehead to the window pane, staring toward the main house. Across the yard, one tall window glowed with light. Behind the glass stood the figure of Lydian, unmoving, her silhouette locked toward the cottage as if sight alone could pierce the darkness. Their windows stared at one another, silent but unyielding. In that room, Lydian moved with the precision of someone retracing old scars. She unlocked a drawer, her hands trembling, and pulled out a folder so worn its edges curled like withered leaves. The papers inside carried the smell of time, yellowed and frayed. She touched them as if they could burn. Names stared back at her, words she had tried to bury. She pressed the folder closed, but the echo of what it contained was louder than any sound in the house. The first mornings in the Pierce house set a rhythm sharper than any clock. Sophia rose before the sun, settled Zaya in her crib within the cottage, and crossed the yard where dew clung to the grass. Inside, the kitchen waited like a stage already prepared. Bertie watched closely at first, but Sophia's hands moved steady, eggs whisked, bread toasted, the coffee pot filled without spilling a drop. By the third morning, Bertie's eyebrows softened just enough to show approval. Sophia felt herself slipping into the shape of the house, learning which door creaked, which pan Vaughan preferred, how the table should gleam before the family entered. Laundry filled the rest of the day. Sheets large enough to blanket a street corner fluttered on the lines. Sophia folded until her fingers ached, whispering to Zaya when she fussed in the playpen Vaughan had set by the window. Even with exhaustion pressing on her, she felt strangely soothed. Each chore, once a burden, now offered rhythm and purpose. The chaos of her old life receded beneath the order of the Pierce estate. Zaya, however, refused to remain a quiet shadow. The little girl's laughter echoed through the halls when Sophia wheeled her into the sitting room. One morning Lydian appeared, drawn perhaps by that sound. She stopped near the playpen, her emerald scarf sliding from one shoulder as she bent to look. Zaya blinked up at her, reached with small fingers and giggled. Something flickered across Lydian's face, fear, longing, then a fragile smile. She knelt, picked up a storybook left on the table, and began to read aloud. Her voice held steady for the first lines, but when Zaya leaned against her arm, her hand trembled. She smoothed the child's curls with cautious strokes, as if touching glass. Sophia stood at a distance, her chest tight. No stranger had ever earned such quick trust from her daughter. Later that week, Sophia overheard Vaughan speaking with a guest about the charitable foundation Lydian managed. The woman had devoted years to programs for children, scholarships, shelters, health drives. She poured herself into causes that eased the lives of other people's sons and daughters. Sophia could not ignore the irony. The woman who seemed carved from discipline softened only when little ones were near. That evening dinner unfolded in quiet elegance. Sophia cleared plates while Zaya sat in her high chair at the table's edge. Lydian lifted the child without hesitation, balancing her on one hip while listening to Vaughan's easy talk about business. He glanced across the table, his mouth curving into a rare grin. "You're holding her like she's yours," he teased gently. The words cracked something fragile. Lydian's composure faltered. Her eyes darted down to the baby, then away, as if the joke had exposed too much. She forced a smile, but her gaze wandered toward the window, unfocused, searching for an escape. Sophia caught the shift and felt the unease settle like dust in her chest. Something unspoken had moved between them all, heavy as a secret pressing to the surface. For days, Lydian carried the weight of a question she could not voice. Each time Zaya's eyes fixed on her with that haunting familiarity, her chest tightened until breathing felt like work. The house remained orderly, laughter and clinking silverware filling its rooms, yet beneath it all she moved like someone stepping across thin ice. One morning she told Vaughan she had errands. Instead of shopping or visiting the charity office, she drove alone to a modest private laboratory tucked away behind a row of glass doors. The receptionist recognized her name and ushered her inside with the respect usually reserved for benefactors. But Lydian had no interest in pleasantries. She asked to speak directly with Dr. Benton, a quiet man with soft-lined eyes who handled delicate matters without fanfare. Behind his desk, he leaned forward as she explained haltingly that she needed certainty about something deeply personal. He did not interrupt, only folded his hands and waited until her words slowed. She confessed that there was a girl working in her home, that the girl had a child, and that sometimes when she looked at them it felt like she was staring into a mirror of her own past. Dr. Benton nodded once, as if he had heard similar stories before. He explained in careful tones that DNA analysis could confirm or dismiss such suspicions with near total accuracy. All that was required were small samples, hair, saliva, anything carrying the blueprint of identity. His voice was calm, professional, yet not without warmth. "But you must understand," he said gently, "a test does not answer the harder question. What will you do if the result confirms your fear?" Lydian pressed her lips together and whispered that she had no choice but to know. The plan grew in silence. She would need her own hair, which was simple enough. From Sophia, a strand clinging to the brush in the bathroom would suffice. From the child, just a snip carefully taken while she slept. Turpo Britain placed a discreet collection kit in her hands and told her the process would be confidential. She thanked him, though the word tasted bitter. That night, she lingered by the crib longer than necessary. Zaya's breath was even, her curls damp against her forehead. With hands that trembled, Lydian slid scissors into the air and cut the smallest piece of hair she could manage. The sound was soft, yet in her mind it boomed like a bell. She pressed the lock into the envelope, fighting back the flood of guilt. Later, while Sophia folded laundry, Lydian quietly lifted a hair from the brush left near the sink. Alone in her room, she placed the 3 samples together, the child's curl, the young woman's strand, and her own. Sealing them felt like sealing a secret too large to carry. She asked herself whether it was betrayal to dig for truth in the shadows, whether love could survive discovery born in silence. But the alternative, living without knowing, was worse. Days passed before the call came. The results were ready. She drove back to the laboratory, heart pounding against her ribs. Dr. Benton offered her the envelope, asking again if she wished him to explain. She shook her head. The paper felt heavier than its weight. She walked out into the parking lot, the late sun burning against her skin, and sat behind the wheel. The envelope lay on the passenger seat, edges sharp against the leather. It glared at her like an accusation, demanding to be opened, yet she could not move. The truth sat within reach, but reaching meant changing everything. The envelope still lay hidden in the bottom drawer of Lydian's desk, yet its contents burned through her every glance, every breath. She carried the truth inside her. But whenever she tried to let it surface, the words turned to ash on her tongue. One evening, while Sophia prepared dinner, the chance appeared. Vaughan was delayed, the kitchen quiet except for the hiss of onions in the pan. Lydian entered, her hands clasped too tightly, and began to speak. She said she admired Sophia's strength, how rare it was for someone so young to hold herself together in a storm. We stumbled on the word storm, her voice wavering. Sophia froze, ladle in hand, and turned with narrowed eyes. The compliment sounded rehearsed, too polished, like another act of charity. Sophia's mouth tightened. She had heard that tone before from people who used kindness as decoration rather than truth. "You all think it's a game," she muttered, not looking directly at Lydian. "Rich folks who like to play at caring. But you don't know what it's like when every bill is a mountain and every cry from your baby is another reminder you're alone." The sting of those words cut deep. Deep. Lydian tried to answer, but silence stretched between them until the air grew heavy. Sophia turned back to the stove, movement sharp, and the moment collapsed before it could become confession. Later that night, Sophia slipped out to the cottage porch with her phone pressed to her ear. Her cousin Seneca answered, voice low but firm. Sophia whispered that something about this house felt twisted, that kindness here always carried shadows. Seneca didn't hesitate. "If it hurts, it ain't a home. Remember that. Protect yourself and that pepumba baby." The words steadied her, like hands on her shoulders in the dark. Meanwhile, Lydian sat alone at her writing desk, the lamp's circle of light small against the vast silence. Paper waited before her, and at last the words began to spill. She wrote not as the polished woman of status, but as the girl she had been at 19. She described the hunger, the freezing nights, the terror of holding a child with no way to provide. She confessed the shame of leaving that child in an institution, telling herself it was mercy. The ink blurred at times from her tears, but she wrote on, page after page, until her hand cramped. In the cottage across the yard, Sophia could not sleep. Zaya stirred once, then settled again, but her mother lay awake, staring at the ceiling. A thought pounded in her head like a drumline. She refused to be anyone's hidden truth. She would not become a secret locked in someone else's shame. Her life had been hard, but it was hers, and she would not let these people rewrite it. The letter Lydian wrote remained folded, unsent, trembling with all the things she had not said aloud. Sophia never saw it. She rose before dawn, her decision etched in her heart, and the house seemed to listen. In the main hall, Vaughan passed his wife and noticed the tremor in her step, the tightness in her jaw. His gaze lingered longer than usual, and suspicion began to grow. The letter had stayed hidden, but the envelope did not. Vaughan had grown tired of half-truths, of glances that shifted when he entered the room. One evening he found the sealed results tucked in the drawer and placed them on the table with quiet finality. When Lydian entered, her face drained of colour. Sophia was there too, summoned without explanation, and suddenly the weight that had pressed on the house for weeks collapsed in on itself. Lydian tried to hold her composure, but the paper trembled in her hands as she slid it across the wobble. Her voice cracked before she found the words. She told Sophia that she had carried a secret for 20 years, a secret that had walked back into her life wearing a tired blouse and holding a baby girl. She said she had tested what her heart already knew. Sophia was her daughter. The room seemed to shrink. Sophia stared at her, eyes wide, then narrowing with a fury that had waited all her life for a target. She whispered first, then shouted, her voice tearing through the air. "Don't call me daughter. You don't get to use that word. You gave that up the day you left me." Lydian's body bent as if the words themselves had struck her. She tried to explain, to speak of hunger, of fear, of youth spent in survival, but Sophia cut her off. She said that excuses were just bandages on wounds that never healed. She said she had raised Zaya alone, had felt every loneliness, and that no woman who had abandoned her child had the right to stand in front of her now and claim kinship. The argument burned hotter, voices rising until the walls themselves seemed to pulse. At one point Vaughan tried to interject, but both women were too deep in their own fire. In the hallway, Bertie paused with a tray in her hands. She heard every word, every broken plea and furious rejection, but she carried the tray back to the kitchen in silence, choosing the safety of looking away. The storm ended not with a reconciliation, but with movement. Safia stumbled to the cottage, tears still drying on her cheeks, and began to throw clothes into a worn bag. Zaya stirred in her crib, her breath ragged as if the world itself had seeped into her tiny lungs. Sophia's hands shook as she packed, her resolve fierce even while her heart ached. Back in the main house, Lydian sat motionless, her hands flat on the table as though pressing them they could hold her together. Vaughan watched, knowing there were no words left that could sew the fracture. The truth had burst open, raw and merciless, and nothing would be the same. That night, in the cottage, Zaya's fever rose. Her skin burned under Sophia's palm, and the child whimpered in restless sleep. The young mother rocked her close, whispering promises she barely believed herself. The universe had chosen its moment. When bonds cracked and futures trembled, it placed a child in danger, forcing them all to face not just past sins, but the fragility of the present. The night stretched into panic. Zaya's small body was hot as fire, her skin glowing with fever that refused to break. Sophia tried cool cloths, whispered prayers, desperate pacing, but nothing calmed the storm within her daughter's chest. The cottage walls felt too close, too fragile, as the cries grew weaker, not stronger. Trembling, Sophia dialed for an ambulance. Her voice cracked as she gave the address. The operator's calm reply, help was on the way, did nothing to steady her racing heart. Before the sirens, before the flashing lights, there was a knock on the cottage door. Lydian stepped in, no permission asked, only purpose. She carried a basin of water, towels over her arm, and in her eyes burned a focus Sophia had never seen before. Without waiting for consent, she knelt by the crib and touched Zaya's damp hair, her hand steady even as her lips trembled. Move the blankets aside, she said softly, and though Sophia wanted to resist, she obeyed. Lydian wrung out a cloth in cool water and began to wipe Zaya's arms, her forehead, her tiny chest. The baby whimpered but did not resist. Sophia watched, torn between anger and gratitude. As Lydian worked with the rhythm of someone who had done this before. I trained once, Lydian whispered, not looking up. Long ago. Pediatric ward. I thought, if I couldn't mother my child, I would at least care for others. Her voice faltered, then steadied again. Hold her upright with me. They worked side by side, two sets of hands moving in quiet synchrony. Sophia's tears fell onto her daughter's blanket as Lydian hummed a low tune, the notes trembling but determined. Sophia joined in without thinking, her own voice breaking but warm. The two voices wove together, a fragile lullaby that rose against the fever's heat. Minutes dragged until headlights flared through the window. The doctor entered briskly, stethoscope already around his neck. He checked Zaya, murmured instructions, then paused, watching the two women still hovering close. Who here is the medical professional? He asked. Lydian's mouth opened, then closed. She shook her head, unwilling to claim a title that might draw questions she was not ready to answer. Sophia looked at her differently, eyes searching, as though for the first time she saw not just wealth and secrets, but knowledge, sacrifice, something buried. The doctor administered medicine, nodded at their efforts, and gave reassurance that the crisis had turned. She'll sleep now. Fever should break by morning. Relief hit like a wave. Sophia sagged into the chair, Zaya limp against her chest, finally drifting into quieter breaths. The doctor left. The night settled, and silence returned. Only then did Sophia look across at Lydian, who sat with her hands folded too tightly, her face streaked with fatigue and unspoken grief. For a long time no one spoke. Finally, almost without realizing, Sophia's lips formed the words she had sworn never to give. They came quiet, almost swallowed by the dark. "Thank you, Mama." The word hung there, fragile, not yet accepted, not yet whole, but it was said, and it changed the air between them forever. The fever passed, and with it came a quiet no one wanted to break. Sophia and Lydian circled each other differently now, careful but no longer at war. They did not rush toward final words or easy forgiveness. Instead, they agreed, without speaking it outright, to let honesty grow slowly. No more half-truths, no more shadows, just space to breathe. Life in the big house and the small cottage settled into the rhythm again. Sunday morning brought church bells and the gentle press of community, where hats and pressed suits filled the pews and the choir carried voices toward heaven. Sophia sat with Zaya in her lap, Vaughan on one side, Lydian on the other. From behind, they must have looked like family, though inside each heart beat to its own uncertainty. Later that week, the veranda filled with the smell of fried catfish and collard greens. Family friends came by, women with sharp tongues and sharper eyes, aunts by love if not by blood. They asked too many questions, laughed too loudly, whispered when they thought no one noticed. Sophia endured their curiosity with grace, and Zaya became the shield everyone adored, the toddler who made strangers softer just by existing. The world outside the home offered its own comedy. Vaughan had long insisted that he and Arkell, his cousin, went to the same barber shop every 2 weeks, a ritual not to be broken. One afternoon, Sophia tagged along, carrying Zaya on her hip. She watched as Vaughan slid into the chair, cape snapped tight, and traded playful insults with Arkell. The barbers laughed, the clippers buzzed, and Sophia saw Vaughan not as the polished businessman, but as a man rooted in his people. The sight warmed her, though she never admitted it aloud. It was Vaughan, perhaps softened by that same day, who brought the next turning point. He found Sophia in his kitchen late one evening, Zaya asleep already, dishes drying in the rack. He leaned against the counter, his voice steady. He told her she had more in her than housework and exhaustion. He suggested Clark Atlanta, classes on the side, a degree she could build a future on. He promised they would help with a nanny, that Zaya would be cared for while she studied. For a long moment Sophia said nothing. The offer was generous, almost unbelievable, but she knew how such gifts could turn into chains. She met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even her. She told him that if she agreed, well, it would be on her terms. A salary for her work, not charity. No illusions of being kept. And if the arrangement ever became unbearable, she would have the right to walk away with her daughter, no questions asked. The words hung heavy in the kitchen, more daring than anything she had spoken before. Sophia braced herself for a refusal, for the tightening of control she had always expected from people with power. Instead, she heard movement behind her. Lydian had entered quietly, listening to every word. She stepped forward, placed her hands flat on the table, and said she accepted all of Sophia's conditions. Her voice carried no hesitation. The fragile world of agreements had been drawn, line by line, and for the first time Sophia felt the balance shift in her favour. The weeks turned into months, and the fragile agreement held. Safia rose early, worked in the house, and in the evenings opened her laptop to attend online classes. Her world stretched wider than the walls of the estate. The first time she received an A on a paper, she hid the printed grade between the pages of her notebook like a secret jewel. Yet when Vaughan found her at the dining table one night, eyes red from studying, he smiled with pride. For the first time in years, Safia allowed herself to believe she was building something more than survival. Zaya grew in rhythm with her, until the little girl began to babble in longer strings, words spilling out like new music. One morning she toddled across the living room toward Lydian, arms wide, and called out, "Babali!" The sound froze the woman in place. Her hands trembled as she bent down to gather the child. Lydian's eyes filled, not with the triumph of recognition, but with something deeper, shame mingled with joy. Sophia watched from the doorway, her feelings complicated, but she did not pull Zaya away. The house itself began to speak in new tones. Laughter over dinner, the squeak of Zaya's shoes on polished floors, the muted cadence of lectures streaming through Sophia's earbuds. Family, in its awkward and uneven form, was becoming a verb, something lived day by day, not a noun carved in stone. But the legal axis could not be ignored. Arkell, Vaughan's cousin, lawyer to the core, began to raise questions in private conversations. He spoke gently but firmly, pointing out that lineage should be clarified, inheritance structured, custody safeguarded. For Zaya's future, he said more than once, adjusting his glasses. Sophia listened, but her response never changed. It was too soon. She could not yet sign papers that bound her to a woman she still held at arm's length. Family is not a signature, she told him, her voice steady. Not yet. The letter, long hidden, finally left the drawer. One evening after Zaya fell asleep, Sophia sat on her bed with the envelope in her lap. She unfolded the pages, ink slightly smeared, words trembling with memory. Lydian had written not excuses but a confession. How young she had been, how broke, how terrified. She admitted the shame that followed her for decades, the ache of imagining her child's birthdays in silence, the torment of knowing she had abandoned but never stopped caring. There was no polish in the sentences, only rawness. Sophia wept despite herself, clutching the pages until they wrinkled. The next morning, when their paths crossed in the hallway, she stopped Lydian. Her voice was soft but firm. She said she was not ready to love, but she was ready to stop hating. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. For Lydian, it was enough to breathe again. That night, as the house quieted, a shadow lingered on the porch. The knock never came, but when Sophia glanced through the window, She saw the outline of a man she once knew too well. Cordell had found them. The figure on the porch did not vanish with the night. By morning, Cordell was seated at the kitchen table as if the years had been no more than a pause. His smile was too wide, his tone too casual, but his eyes carried hunger. He spoke of Zaya with a possessive certainty that made Sophia's skin crawl. "That's my baby too," he said, drumming his fingers against the polished wood. "And you got her living in some mansion with rich folks who think they can buy anything? I got rights, and I'm here to claim them." Sophia's breath came shallow. The memory of his absence during her pregnancy, the silence after Zaya's birth, rose like smoke in the room. He had done nothing, given nothing, yet now he leaned back in the chair as if his claim was carved into law. Vaughan entered from the hall, expression tight. He did not raise his voice, but his words struck like iron. "This is not a marketplace. In our family, nobody bargains with people." Cordell smirked, brushing off the warning. He dropped hints about lawyers he might hire, about tabloids hungry for stories of young mothers and wealthy benefactors. "Imagine the headlines," he said with mock sweetness. "Girl from nothing, caught up with her employers. Might be messy for y'all's reputation, unless you want to make a deal." Arkell, sharp-eyed and cautious, took Sophia aside later. His voice was steady, but the subtext was clear. If Cordell pressed his so-called rights, custody could be questioned. Courts did not always weigh history, they weighed paperwork. "You need to understand," he told her gently. "His angle isn't love, it's leverage. He'll use every rumour, every camera, every reporter that'll listen. We need to prepare." Lydian listened in silence, her hand gripping the arm of her chair until her knuckles whitened. She had lived long enough to know how quickly whispers became storms in the circles she moved in. But she also knew one truth. Cordell had never been a father, only a shadow that chose to return when the lights were bright. At the first preliminary hearing, Sophia felt the ground tilt beneath her. The courtroom smelled of old wood and paper, the air heavy with the weight of judgment. Cordell sat across the aisle in a new suit, false confidence draped over him like cologne. He spoke loudly of responsibility, of paternal instinct awakened. Sophia wanted to scream, but Vaughan rose instead. His words cut through the theatre. "This child is loved, raised, and cared for every day by her mother. Family is not a surname, it's action. And in this family, no one is a bargaining chip." The judge listened, tapping a pen against the desk. After a long pause, the gavel came down, not with closure but with complication. "This case requires mediation," the judge said firmly. "This is not only family versus stranger, this is family versus family name, and it will be settled with care." Sophia's heart pounded as the session closed. Mediation meant more battles, more eyes on her life. She clutched Zaya's hand, knowing the fight had only just begun. The morning had carried no warning. Vaughan had laughed at breakfast, teased Arkell about a crooked tie, kissed Lydian's cheek as though the years had not yet weighed him down. Then, without signal, the sound came, an uneven gasp, a chair scraping hard against the floor and the thud of a body collapsing. The house, usually filled with rhythm, fell into silence so sharp it sliced through every wall. Vaughan lay on the ground, his hand pressed to his chest, his breath short and ragged. The ambulance lights painted the driveway in red, but inside the family's world shrank to whispers and fear. In the hospital room, machines hummed, wires clung to Vaughan's skin, and the man who had always stood like stone now looked fragile, pale against the sheets. The doctors called it what it was, a heart attack. They spoke in numbers and percentages, but to Sophia it sounded like sand slipping through an hourglass. The house bent under the weight of absence. Sophia stepped into roles she had never claimed before. She oversaw the staff, handled the schedules, answered calls meant for Vaughan. Lydian barely left the hospital wing, her eyes fixed on monitors, her voice hoarse from speaking softly into a man who could not always answer. Bertie anchored the kitchen, feeding everyone who stumbled in with weary faces, and the church, with its pews filled and hands lifted, prayed aloud for Vaughan's recovery, as if faith alone might stitch his heart back together. One night, when exhaustion blurred the hours, Sophia carried Zaya into the hospital room. The little girl's small hand slid into her mother's, and then into Lydian's, and finally rested against Vaughan's own limp fingers. 3 generations pressed together, forming a circle of warmth around a man suspended between silence and life. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, not of weakness, but of recognition. This was family, tested, cracked, but unbroken. The judge, hearing of the emergency, postponed the mediation. Time was granted, though no one knew if Vaughan had any left. Days passed like seasons. Slowly, Vaughan's chest rose steadier. His voice regained its gravel. When his eyes opened fully, he searched for the faces that had not left his side. Sophia was there, holding Zaya. Lydian, weary but strong, clutched his other hand. Bertie hovered in the background, crossing herself quietly. Vaughan's lips curved into the faintest smile. He looked at Sophia and spoke with the authority of a man who had nearly lost everything. "You carry this house now, and you carry it well. Whatever choices you make, I bless them." His blessing fell on her like a mantle, heavy but affirming. Sophia nodded, her throat tight, but she did not reply with grand declarations. Later that night, standing with Lydian in the quiet corridor, she finally spoke. Her words low and deliberate. "Don't wait for me to say what you want to hear. Wait for my steps. If I move toward you, that will be the truth." Lydian froze at the sentence, caught between hope and ache. Sophia's eyes held no softness, but neither did they burn with rejection. It was a promise in motion, not in speech. And for the first time, Lydian understood that silence could be more powerful than any word. The recovery of Vaughan steadied the house like an anchor, dropped after a storm. Days folded into weeks, and the sharp fear of losing him softened into vigilance. Yet the unspoken weight between Sophia and Lydian still lingered, present in every shared glance, in every unfinished sentence. Sophia had promised steps, not words, but one evening those steps carried her farther than she had ever expected. It was a quiet night. The house had long since dimmed, Vaughan asleep under careful watch, Zaya drowsy after a bedtime story. Sophia lingered in the doorway of the study, where Lydian sat sorting through papers she never seemed to finish. For a moment, the younger woman simply stood there, studying the face that had haunted and comforted her in equal measure. Then, with a breath that trembled but refused to break, she spoke aloud. "Mamma." The single word did not echo through the room, but it filled it all the same. Lydian's eyes widened, her lips permuting without any flourish. No applause, no speeches, only tears that glimmered like glass as she whispered back, "Yes." Her joy was not grand, but quiet, the kind that seeps into bones and stays there. It was the sound of a long journey finally landing on solid ground. Beyond the walls of their fragile peace, Cordell circled like a vulture, pressing claims and stirring whispers. He demanded rights, invoked his blood, and threatened scandal. But when the time came, when lawyers sat across long tables, he found not a girl to intimidate, but a fortress of unity. Vaughan, still thin from illness but resolute, declared with steel in his voice, "In this family, nobody is property." Arkell closed every loophole with precision. Lydian never wavered. And Sophia, seated beside them, met Cordell's eyes without a trace of fear. By the end of the mediation, Cordell signed the papers. The deal was not about victory, but about closure, a sum that ensured his silence and the realization that he could not breach the wall they had built together. He left with the swagger of a man who pretended he had chosen to retreat. But everyone in that room knew otherwise. The path forward unfolded with measured care. Legal documents were drawn to secure what mattered, the cottage where Sophia lived with Zaya, and a fund for the child's education. Everything else, Sophia insisted, would be earned, not inherited. "My road is mine," she said firmly. Lydian accepted, though her heart yearned to give more. Respecting her daughter's conditions became its own act of love. Years moved gently, not with fanfare, but with rhythm. Zaya grew into a girl whose fingers danced across piano keys, filling the house with notes that once would have sounded foreign but now felt like home. Vaughan's laughter returned, slower but stronger. Bertie still guarded the rules, though even she softened at the sound of Zaya's voice. One evening, as the sky burned with the colours of a southern sunset, 3 women sat together on the veranda, Sophia, Lydian and Zaya, sorting through a book of old photographs. Some were faded, edges frayed, yet each told a story of survival and repair. Zaya held up her picture and asked why everyone looked younger. Sophia smiled and said, "'Cause time was still teaching us." The child tilted her head and declared, "Then happy endings are not magic, they are work." The women exchanged glances, and none disagreed. As the light shifted and the last notes of Zaya's piano drifted through the open window, The house stood whole. Not perfect, not untouched by grief, but mended. And in that mending lay its strength.